Picture yourself stepping off a time-traveling boat onto the banks of the Nile. The air so thick with heat, it feels like walking into an oven. Before you can even marvel at the pyramids in the distance, your vision blurs, your knees buckle, and you collapse onto the scorching sand. This isn't just exhaustion, it's the crushing reality of ancient Egypt's relentless climate. While we often romanticize this civilization for its golden treasures and towering monuments, we forget one brutal truth. Surviving here wasn't just about avoiding crocodiles or building tombs, it was a daily battle against a sun that showed no mercy. So, could you have lasted a single week in this furnace? Forget Hollywood's glamorous depictions of linen-clad pharaohs strolling comfortably under palm trees. The real ancient Egypt was a place where temperatures regularly soared past 110 degrees, where shade was a luxury, and where dehydration could kill faster than any scorpion. This was a world where every aspect of life, from the clothes people wore to the gods they prayed to, was shaped by one unavoidable force: the unyielding, life-sapping heat. Today, we're peeling back the layers of time to uncover how ordinary people not only endured, but thrived in what might be history's most hostile climate. You'll discover why their solutions were as ingenious as they were desperate, from architecture designed to trick the wind, to diets that staved off heatstroke, to social rituals built around the sun's cruel schedule. This isn't just a history lesson, it's a survival story, and by the end, you'll see ancient Egypt in a whole new light, one that burns far brighter and far hotter than you ever imagined. So grab a drink, trust me, you'll want one, and let's step into the scorching heart of the past. The first shock would hit you before you even opened your eyes, the dry, suffocating weight of air so hot it steals your breath. Ancient Egypt wasn't just warm, it was a land where summer temperatures routinely climbed past 40 degrees Celsius, where shade offered little relief, and where the Nile's annual floods traded scorching dryness for sweltering, mosquito-filled humidity. Today's heat waves might last weeks, but for the ancient Egyptians, this was life year-round, no air conditioning, no emergency cooling centers, just an endless battle against a sun that turned clay bricks into baking stones and sand into coals underfoot. The Nile, that famous lifeline, was both savior and tormentor. While its floods brought fertile soil, they also drenched the air with moisture, turning the already brutal heat into a suffocating steam bath. Imagine working on a pyramid under that sun, your linen tunic soaked through, the humidity making every movement feel like wading through hot soup, and when the waters receded. The landscape baked again, cracking under a sky that hadn't seen rain for months. Even at night, temperatures rarely dipped below 30 degrees, offering no real respite, just a shallow breath before the next day's furnace reignited. Modern heat records barely compare. We complain when thermometers hit 35 degrees for a few days, but the ancient Egyptians endured months where 40 was the baseline. Their entire civilization became a masterclass in adaptation. Homes built with thick mud brick walls to trap coolness, work schedules shifted to dawn and dusk. Even their gods reflected the climate's cruelty. Ra, the sun deity, was both giver of life and bringer of deadly heat. This wasn't just weather, it was a constant, inescapable force that shaped every ritual, every meal, every stitch of clothing. To understand ancient Egypt, you have to feel that heat in your bones, the kind that doesn't just inconvenience you, but rewires how you live. At first glance, the layered linen garments of ancient Egypt seem like a cruel joke. Why bundle up when the sun is already trying to cook you alive? But this was no fashion misstep, it was survival engineering. While modern logic says bare skin equals cooler, the Egyptians understood something counterintuitive. Loose, tightly woven linen acted like a personal climate control system. Their knee-length tunics and draped shawls weren't just cultural markers, they were high-tech heat armor. The secret lay in the fabric itself. Egyptian linen wasn't the rough cloth we might imagine. It was spun into feather-like layers so finely woven that some were nearly transparent. This created a microclimate. Sunlight bounced off the pale surface, while breezes slipped through the gaps between fibers, carrying sweat away from the skin. Picture wearing a dozen window screens instead of a solid black t-shirt. That's how their clothing turned the desert's scorching breath into something survivable. And here's where modern desert dwellers could learn a lesson. Bedouins today still wear thick robes, and science confirms why. A single loose layer traps cool air next to the skin like insulation, while multiple thin layers, like the Egyptians used, create chimney effects that funnel heat upward and away. Meanwhile, exposed skin bakes under direct sun, pushing body temperatures dangerously higher. The ancient Egyptians didn't just tolerate their wraps, they thrived because of them. Even workers hauling pyramid stones stripped down only to waist wraps, never going fully bare, knowing their linen was the only thing standing between them and heatstroke. This wardrobe wisdom bled into their culture. Linen wasn't just practical, it was sacred, associated with purity and the gods. Priests wore it exclusively, and mummies were swaddled in hundreds of yards of the stuff, not just for the afterlife, but because the fabric's natural antibacterial properties slowed decay. Every thread wove together survival, spirituality, and social status. So next time you reach for a tank top in sweltering weather, remember, 3,000 years ago, people who built monuments under a murderous sun knew better. Sometimes, the best way to beat the heat is to wrap yourself in it. Now imagine walking into one of Egypt's towering stone temples at midday. What should feel like respite from the sun becomes an oven of a different kind. Those massive limestone blocks, brilliant white under the sun, didn't just reflect heat. They absorbed it like a sponge, radiating warmth inward until the very walls throbbed. For priests performing sacred rituals in the sanctuary's windowless depths, this wasn't just discomfort, it was a trial by fire. The innermost chambers, designed to symbolize the underworld, became suffocating swelters where temperatures could soar 20 degrees hotter than outside, the stagnant air thick with incense and sweat. We know exactly how unbearable this was thanks to desperate scribbles like the Amarna letters' ancient complaints etched into clay. One official, stationed at a desert outpost, moaned about his palace becoming a kiln where even bronze buckled, while another described nobles fainting during court ceremonies. The very materials meant to showcase power became torture devices. Polished floors reflecting sunlight upward, columns trapping heat between them like bread in a baker's oven. And yet, rituals demanded endurance. Priests wrapped in layers of linen, chanting for hours as their sandals stuck to blistering stone. Their solutions were as clever as they were desperate. Temple architects built wind catchers, narrow shafts funneling breezes down to floor level, while courtyards placed plunge pools in strategic shadows. Some relief came at night, when priests poured water over heated stones to create steam baths for purification, turning suffering into spirituality, but perhaps the most telling detail. The god Ptah's shrine at Memphis was nicknamed the place where the heat descends, not a poetic metaphor, but a warning etched in stone. These weren't just buildings, they were thermal battlegrounds where survival depended on innovation as much as faith. Before the first light could soften the horizon, the fields along the Nile were already alive with movement, not the leisurely pace of pastoral paintings, but the desperate hurry of farmers racing against the sun's wrath. Bent double in shadeless plots, they worked with hands cracked from heat and feet buried in mud, gone lukewarm overnight. Irrigation wasn't just labor, it was a life or death calculation. Every drop diverted from canals had to reach crops before the morning's deceptive coolness burned away, leaving water to evaporate into the oven-like air by midday. The back-breaking rhythm never stopped. Men wielding shadoofs, those counterweighted poles used to lift water, moved like human metronomes, their shoulders reddened under thin linen straps as they hauled bucket after bucket. Children scurried between rows, patching broken irrigation channels with Nile silt before the earth could bake hard as pottery. And always, the sun climbed higher, turning the river's gift into a cruel teasewater everywhere, yet none to drink fast enough to replace what their bodies shed in sweat. By noon, a farmer might lose as much as 2 liters of fluid just through his skin, salt crusting his brows like a second set of eyelashes. Harvests weren't just timed to crop cycles, they were dictated by the mercy of seasons. The Nile's floodwaters receded by autumn, leaving fields damp enough to plant before the worst heat returned. Winter became the only window for heavy labor cooler air made bearable by winds sweeping in from the north. Come spring, workers practically sprinted to gather wheat and barley before summer's furnace reignited, knowing grains left too long would shrivel into husk. Even their tools were heat-adapted sickles with curved blades to minimize bending, woven reed hats soaked in water to create evaporative cooling. Yet for all this suffering, the greatest insult lay in the soil itself. That famous black land of Egypt, enriched by millennia of floods, could reach temperatures over 50 degrees at the surface, hot enough to blister bare knees during weeding. Farmers developed calluses not just on hands, but on joints from kneeling on scorching earth. Relief came only in fragments, swallowing raw garlic to prevent heat exhaustion, a trick modern athletes still use, soaking cloths in Nile water to drape over necks, or chewing tamarind pods for their natural electrolyte. Their entire calendar revolved around avoiding the sun's fury, with records showing punishments for overseers who forced labor during peak heat. This wasn't just agriculture, it was a war waged with hoes and human resilience, where survival meant outsmarting the very climate that fed them. And when the heat won, as it often did, the sand along the Nile banks held more than just seeds. It swallowed the sweat, the tears, and sometimes the farmers themselves. Now picture the leather straps of your armor already cutting into sweat-slicked shoulders as you march beneath a white-hot sky, each step kicking up dust that sticks to your damp skin. This was the reality for soldiers under Thutmose III during campaigns like Megiddo, where the greatest enemy wasn't opposing armies, but the sun itself. His annals don't just boast of victories. They're filled with desperate accounts of men collapsing mid-march, their bronze helmets turning into cooking pots under the unrelenting heat. Egyptian military gear was brutally effective against arrows and blades, but against 40-degree heat, it became a death trap. Leather breastplates, boiled to hardness, absorbed sunlight like blacktop, while linen undershirts meant to cushion metal scales instead trapped sweat against the skin. Helmets with nape guards blocked breezes that might have cooled necks, and shields strapped to backs became personal saunas. Marching formations only made it worse. Dust from hundreds of sandals hung thick in the air, clogging throats already parched from rationed water. The Megiddo campaign records reveal chilling details. Soldiers drank from stagnant ponds just to wet their tongues, knowing dysentery might kill them slower than dehydration. Some stripped off armor at night to find salt rings where sweat had evaporated faster than their bodies could replace fluids. Thutmose's scribes noted entire units rendered useless by heatstroke, their spears trembling in hands swollen from sun exposure. And when battles did come, the frantic energy of combat pushed body temperatures past breaking points. Men died with no wounds, but faces twisted in the agony of heat exhaustion. Yet their adaptations were as ingenious as they were desperate. Scouts timed marches to oasis shadows, while water carriers followed with skins cooled by evaporation tricks borrowed from desert nomads. Before major engagements, commanders rubbed wet clay on exposed skin to prevent sunburn, a primitive sunscreen that also helped regulate body temperature. Even their battle tactics reflected the climate. Ambushes timed for dawn when enemies were still sluggish from sleepless, sweltering nights, the greatest testament to this struggle. The afterlife prayers of common soldiers often begged not for glory, but for shade. Their ghosts weren't feared in dark tombs, but in sun-baked battlefields where the heat never relented, even in death. The true cost of the pyramids wasn't measured in gold or years. It was written in the broken bodies of the workers who hauled their stones. Imagine gripping a rope slick with sweat, shoulders raw from linen straps, as you and 40 others drag a 2.5-ton block across sand hot enough to blister bare feet. The air shimmers like a mirage, your throat so parched you can't even cry out when the rope snaps and the stone rolls onto your leg. This wasn't just hard labor, it was a slow-cooked nightmare where heatstroke killed as surely as falling rocks. Archaeology confirms the horror. Worker cemeteries near Gezer reveal spines twisted from decades of unnatural strain, bones scarred by stress fractures from lifting and scorching temperatures. Some skeletons show signs of chronic dehydration, sunken eye sockets, porous bones where calcium leached away from endless sweating, the worst evidence. Healed fractures in nearly every body, proof that accidents happened daily in conditions where focus evaporated faster than Nile water on hot limestone. Their only relief was as brutal as the work itself. Ostraka pottery fragments used as notepads record desperate measures, foremen distributing salt tablets to prevent cramps, workers chewing on wet reeds to fool empty stomachs, even gangs rotating every 15 minutes to avoid collapse. The pyramid's shadow, creeping inch by inch, became their clock. Those brief moments in its shade were more precious than gold, and when the sun won, the records of the gangs, like the drunkards of Menkora, hint at the dark humor that kept them going, naming crews after the only thing that numbed the pain. The stones themselves tell another story. Geologists found mineral deposits on blocks at Karnak, not from rain, but from evaporated sweat. Each slab moved in summer required 12 liters of water per worker per day, a logistical nightmare when the nearest well might be hours away. Some crews resorted to gruesome shortcuts. Medical papyri describe men drinking their own urine when water ran out, a practice that only hastened kidney failure. Yet the greatest cruelty lay in the math. To build Khufu's pyramid in 20 years, workers had to set one block every 2 minutes, an impossible pace under normal conditions, let alone when the mercury topped 45 degrees. No wonder later pharaohs abandoned pyramid building. The human cost was too high, even for gods on earth. The pyramids stand today not just as tombs, but as grim monuments to thousands who worked themselves to dust under a sun that showed no mercy. The moment a freshly slaughtered goat hit the marketplace in Thebes, the clock started ticking. A race against spoilage so relentless, it would make modern food safety inspectors faint. Under the Egyptian sun, meat could turn putrid in less than 3 hours, crawling with flies drawn to the rich scent of decay. Butchers worked at a frenzied pace, hacking carcasses apart before the morning heat turned their stalls into breeding grounds for bacteria. For those who couldn't afford to eat their purchase immediately, options were bleak. Risk violent food poisoning or choke down meat so heavily salted it burned the tongue. This wasn't just inconvenience, it was culinary warfare. The stench of Thebes markets clung to clothing like a second skin, a nauseating cocktail of rancid fat, fermenting fish guts, and the acrid tang of urine used to soften hardened leather sack. Salted Nile perch, stacked in oozing piles, became the protein of necessity rather than choice, their flesh so saturated with preservatives that diners sometimes drank entire jars of beer just to wash down a single bite. Even bread, normally a safe staple, could betray you if baked too early in the day, developing invisible mold spores in the humid air before reaching your table. The wealthy had their own desperate solutions. Tomb paintings show servants fanning platters of roasted duck to keep flies at bay, while underground storage pits lined with natron salt slowed decay if you could stomach meat that tasted like embalming fluid. One surviving letter from a Memphis nobleman complains of a feast ruined by meat that walked off the plate. A grim joke about maggots. For the poor, starvation often seemed preferable to gambling on last week's mystery cuts, sold cheap by vendors who knew the midday sun would hide their ware's true condition under a glaze of shimmering heat haze. Yet the greatest irony, Egypt's obsession with the afterlife made food preservation a spiritual crisis. Offerings to the dead meant to sustain souls for eternity rotted within days, forcing priests to replace real meat with stone carvings or painted substitute. The gods demanded freshness, but the climate delivered only decay. Even in death, no one escaped the tyranny of the sun. Imagine lying on your back as the last light fades, your matted hair sticking to a mud brick roof still radiating the day's heat like a griddle. This was bedtime in ancient Egypt, not tucked under blankets, but sprawled under the stars, praying for even the faintest breeze while trying to ignore the scuttling sounds of nocturnal hunters below. Homes built to withstand the sun became heat traps by nightfall, their thick walls holding warmth like clay ovens long after sunset. Families faced a cruel choice: swelter inside with stale, suffocating air, or risk sleeping outdoors where scorpions climbed walls seeking the warmth of human bodies. Survival after dark required ingenuity. Rooftops became makeshift bedrooms, with woven reed mats laid over palm wood beams. Parents tethered children to their waists with linen ropes, not to prevent rolling off, but to yank them back when a scorpion's telltale shadow crossed moonlight. The wealthiest slathered natron paste on their skin, its cooling evaporation mimicking sweat without dehydration, while others soaked their sleeping linens in Nile water, shivering briefly before the fabric dried into a stiff, salty crust within minutes. A translated lullaby from Deir el-Medina captures this duality perfectly. Sleep, little one, let the moon's cool kiss fool you, for the sun licks his lips for morning. Beneath the poetic imagery lay harsh reality. That cool kiss was the rare nighttime breeze that might drop temperatures to 30 degrees Celsius, while the sun's lips promised another day of relentless burning. Even their bedtime songs were warnings wrapped in tenderness. Archaeology reveals how deeply heat shapes sleep itself. Skeletal remains show compressed vertebrae from years of dozing in fetal positions on hard surfaces, no one stretched out when sharing a rooftop with 6 relatives. Medical papyri list remedies for night bites, including poultices of garlic and honey for scorpion stings applied by candlelight. The wealthiest could afford cooling slaves who fanned sleepers all night, but even pharaohs weren't spared. Tutankhamun's tomb included an ornate headdress designed to elevate his neck above conductive heat, its inscription begging the breeze god Shu for relief. This wasn't rest, it was another shift in the unending work of staying alive. Children learned to scan for scorpions before laying down mats, while adults timed sleep cycles to the stars' movement, waking before dawn to claim the last cool moments. Every night was a gamble: endure the indoor furnace or risk the rooftop's dangers. No wonder their word for dream also meant a breath stolen from the day. Even pharaohs wrapped in gold couldn't escape the sun's wrath. While peasants baked in fields, Amenhotep III lounged in his sprawling palace complex at Malkata, marvel of shaded colonnades, artificial lakes, and garden courtyards designed to cheat the heat. But his mummy tells a darker story, skin pocked with lesions from decades of sun exposure, the leathery texture of a man who spent lifetimes under the same scorching sky as his lowest subject. The luxury of royalty was an illusion. Those breezy palace halls, their thick mud brick walls absorbed daytime heat like sponges, releasing it slowly through the night so even silk-draped beds felt like kiln shelves. Servants waved ostrich feather fans in shifts, their arms cramping as they stirred air thick with pollen from imported flowers wilted by the sun and those picturesque garden ponds. They bred mosquitoes by the thousands, turning oases into fever traps where nobles scratched at malarial bites beneath their jeweled collars. Amenhotep's medical records reveal the truth behind the gilded suffering. Court physicians prescribed chilled melon pulp for burns from thrown armrests left in direct sunlight, while scribes noted how the king's ceremonial wig heavy with gold beads gave him heat rashes that oozed into his linen headdress. Even his famed window of appearances, where he greeted subjects, was strategically positioned to avoid afternoon sun, the limestone ledge specially smooth so his sweat-slick palms wouldn't slip during ceremonies. The cruelest irony lay in their attempts to outsmart nature. At the height of summer, royal households relocated to delta palaces where Nile breezes offered brief relief, only to find the marsh's humidity rotting their precious furniture and warping ivory game boards. Some took to wearing dampened faience bead nets over their wigs, the evaporating water providing momentary coolness until the beads grew hot as cooking stones. Tomb paintings of banquets show guests clutching lotus blossoms not for their beauty, but to press the dew-cooled petals against their throats between bites of sun-warmed goose. Yet for all their innovations, the rulers shared one grim fate with the laborers building their tombs. Examination of royal mummies shows nearly universal signs of advanced dehydration, collapsed vertebrae from disc shrinkage, arthritic joints worsened by chronic mineral loss. The sun made no distinction between a pharaoh's gilded sandals and a farmer's callous feet. In the end, even the gods chosen baked alike. The nursery walls still bear the faint charcoal sketches, small hands tracing the hippopotamus goddess Taweret over and over, as if repetition could strengthen her power. These weren't doodles, they were desperate prayers. In a land where summer temperatures could kill a healthy adult by noon, infants faced odds far crueler. Archaeologists find their tiny bodies curled in fetal positions, bones so fragile they crumble at a touch, skin mummified by dehydration rather than embalming oils. The amulets strung above their reed cradles tell the story, blue faience beads shaped like water droplets, clay discs inscribed Great Taweret, turn your wet muzzle toward this child. Even the god's protection came with an unspoken caveat, if the sun allows it. Newborns suffered first from the air itself, Without sweat glands fully developed, their bodies couldn't regulate temperature, overheating faster than a clay pot left in direct sunlight. Wet nurses, when available, dribbled Nile water into their mouths hourly, but under those linen swaddles, invisible disasters unfolded. Heat rash bloomed into open sores, attracting flies that laid eggs in the folds of their neck. Medical papyri describe remedies so futile they ached to read. For a child burning from within, place cooled lettuce leaves upon the fontanelle. Lettuce, sacred to the fertility god Men, was meant to cool via symbolism rather than science. The wealthier fared little better. Excavations at Amarna's elite quarters reveal nursery chambers lined with water-soaked reed mats, a well-intentioned death trap when humidity combined with heat to breed respiratory infection. Some mothers resorted to chilling hematite stones in underground chambers, pressing them to their babies' chests until the rocks grew warm as blood. The porous-wrapped infants in rags dunked in irrigation ditches, unaware the tepid water teemed with parasites that attacked weakened system. Most haunting are the amulet spells themselves, scratched onto pottery shards and tucked beneath cradle boards. One, now in Cairo's museum, pleads, "Let her sweat as the riverbank sweats at dawn." But the Nile's banks didn't sweat, they evaporated. For every 10 children born, census records suggest 4 never saw their first birthday, their lives measured not in years, but in how many sunrise naps they survived. The sun spared no one, but its cruelest blows fell on those too small to lift a hand against it. Tarot's amulets outnumbered all others in graves, a grotesque math where divine protection became the most buried treasure. Parents knew the truth. In a land where even shadows burned, sometimes the gods were just witnesses. Even the Nile's life-giving waters hid invisible killers. Beneath its shimmering surface, parasites thrived in warmth that rarely dipped below 25 degrees Celsius, a perfect breeding ground for tiny monsters. Schistosoma worms burrowed through bare skin as farmers stood knee-deep in irrigation channels, while Giardia microbes turned sacred river water into a gut-wrenching curse. The evidence survives in mummies' intestines, desiccated remains still housing the eggs of worms that wriggled through their ancestors' bowels 3,000 years ago. This wasn't just discomfort, it was mass biological warfare. Medical papyri describe the bloody flux, with horrifying precision victims shitting themselves to death as dehydration compounded the damage. Workers building Ramses monuments suffered outbreaks so severe that construction halted, with payroll records showing whole crews bedridden for weeks. The wealthy fared little better. One noblewoman's tomb inscription boasts she drank only upper Nile waters, unaware that her prized clean source carried the same parasites just downstream from a bathing herd of infected cattle. Their attempted solutions often worsened the suffering. Natron, the same salt used to preserve corpses, was stirred into drinking water to kill microbes. The result, liquid so alkaline it burned throats and stripped tooth enamel, yet still failed to neutralize all threats. Workers at Deir el-Medina left behind complaints scratched on pottery shards. The overseer's natron turns my belly to fire, but the shits return by moonrise. Some preferred to risk illness rather than endure the cure, sneaking untreated water when officials weren't watching. The cruelest twist lay in their religious practices. Purification rituals before temple ceremonies required drinking Nile water, holy liquid, teeming with the very pathogens priests sought to ward off. Archaeologists find traces of dysentery causing entamoeba in the latrines of Karnak's sacred precincts, proof that even the gods' servants couldn't escape nature's revenge. What began as life-giving sips often ended with worshippers crouching in agony behind shrines, their prayers interrupted by bodily betrayal. Modern water tests tell the full story. Sediment cores reveal parasite egg concentrations 8 times higher near ancient settlements than in untouched stretches of river. The very civilization that worshipped the Nile as a deity was being slowly poisoned by it, one contaminated gulp at a time. A noblewoman's carefully painted coal lines didn't just smudge. They bled down her face like Inkai tears within minutes of stepping into the midday sun. That iconic Egyptian eyeliner, meant to ward off evil spirits and reduce glare, became a greasy mess as sweat pooled in the corners of eyes, carrying powdered galena and malachite in dark streaks across powdered cheek. Archaeologists find tiny glass pots still caked with hardened coal, their contents fused into lumps from being left too near windows where sunlight turned them into terry puddles. The same makeup that protected vision also became a humiliating giveaway of discomfort. No amount of linen fanning could stop the slow meltdown of royal composure. Wigs offered no refuge either. What looked regal in tomb paintings, those intricate braids, threaded with gold beads, transformed into unbearable ovens under the sun's gaze. Human hair wigs, worn to prevent lice and showcase status, trapped heat against scalps until wearers developed blisters. Excavations at Deir el-Medina reveal workers' letters complaining of scalp fires, their wigs stiffened by evaporated sweat into scratchy helmets. Wealthier women resorted to ostrich oil rubs to soothe burns, but the true horror emerged at banquets. Beeswax used to secure elaborate hairstyles would soften in the heat, sending curls slumping sideways like melted candle wax. Then there were the perfumed cones, those fragrant wax lumps, perched atop partigores' heads in frescoes. Far from slowly releasing aroma, they became sticky disasters in real-world heat. Tomb texts describe cones liquefying into rancid dribbles that soaked through wigs, mixing with sweat to form a glue-like paste that matted hair and stained linen tunics. One satirical poem from the New Kingdom mocks a nobleman fleeing his own feast, his cone having dripped into his eyes like a blind hippo. Even the solutions were flawed, cones made with harder resins cracked under direct sun, showering wearers with sharp scented shards. The bitter irony, these beauty standards existed precisely because of the climate. Coal protected eyes from sun glare, wigs prevented scalp burns, and perfumes masked the stench of sweat. Yet in obeying fashion, Egyptians endured a cycle of suffering, fixing their smudged makeup only to sweat it off again, scratching at wig-induced rashes while reapplying ointments that attracted more sand and flies. Their quest for dignity in the heat became its own kind of torment, every cosmetic solution undone by the very sun they worshipped. One moment you're trudging through golden dunes under a clear blue sky, the next, the horizon vanishes behind a churning wall of sand moving faster than a galloping horse. Those weren't mere gusts punishing ancient Egyptian travelers. They were Habub's monstrous sandstorms capable of burying entire caravans alive. Near Dakka Oasis, archaeologists uncovered the proof. Camel bones still yoked together in collapsed formations, brittle fingers of mummified traders clutching empty water skins, even the remnants of a child's sandal preserved under meters of compacted dust. These weren't graves dug deliberately, they were snapshots of terror frozen in time. The mechanics of a Habub made escape nearly impossible. Unlike ordinary sandstorms that blew grains horizontally, these hellish fronts rolled vertically, creating a suffocating cascade of airborne sediment so dense it blocked the sun within seconds. Excavated journals from the Roman period describe the experience as drowning in dry water, with victims inhaling kiln-hot dust that seared lungs and fused eyelashes shut with molten resin like sweat. Caravans caught mid-route had minutes to react. Tying cloth over noses proved futile when sand infiltrated every seam, grinding between teeth like a second meal. Survival tactics bordered on the macabre. Traders near Karga Oasis developed a brutal protocol. At the first sign of a Habub's telltale copper-colored horizon, they'd slaughter the weakest camel, hollow its stomach cavity, and take turns sheltering inside the still warm corpse. Papyrus fragments from a merchant's ledger list shocking inventory losses, not just goods, but people tallied as coldly as shattered pottery, lost to sand, 3 guards, 1 scribe, 8 donkeys. Recovered sandals, 2 pairs. The math of these storms was unforgiving. Even burial customs acknowledged the Habub's cruelty. Tombs of wealthy merchants often included storm amulets, a tiny alabaster carvings of Taweret with her mouth sewn shut, meant to symbolically silence the wind. Yet the most poignant finds come from children's graves near caravan routes, where miniature reed dolls were buried with faces turned away from the western desert, eternally hiding from the storms that stole their parents. The sand didn't just erase lives, it rewrote geography. Satellite imaging reveals ancient trade paths abruptly veering miles off course, where desperate drivers wandered blind until their dehydrated corpses became the next travelers' grim mile markers. Modern desert guides still whisper warnings when the air grows too still because in Egypt, the deadliest storms began with silence. The medical papyri of Thebes tell of men who staggered into temples babbling about golden scorpions crawling from the walls, not drunk on wine, but on something far more dangerous, the sun's relentless assault on their mind. These weren't mere fever dreams. Scrolls like the Ebers papyrus document cases of sun madness. With chilling precision, laborers digging tombs in the Valley of the Kings, suddenly dropping their tools to chase non-existent pools of water, or scribes mid-sentence writing in circles as their hands shook from neural collapse. Priests called these episodes the breath of Ra's wrath, but modern physicians recognized the terrifying truth. Advanced heatstroke hallucinations, the mechanics were merciless. When core body temperatures surpassed 40 degrees Celsius, the brain literally cooked in its own fluids. Blood vessels dilated desperately to cool the skin, starving the brain of oxygen while electrolyte imbalances scrambled nerve signals. Victims didn't just see mirages, they felt phantom rain on scorched skin, heard voices in the rustle of dry reeds, even lashed out at companions they swore had transformed into demons. One workman's account, scratched on an ostraka, describes his own father screaming about the sand becoming serpents before collapsing into fatal convulsions. Temple healers compounded the danger with their cures. Believing the visions were spiritual messages, they'd isolate sufferers in dark chambers thick with hallucinogenic incense, myrrh and blue lotus smoke that only deepened the delirium. Excavated medical kits contain copper scalpels used to release evil humors. By bleeding patients already on the verge of circulatory collapse, the few who survived often had permanent damage. Skeletal remains near Deir el-Medina show teeth grooves worn smooth from years of involuntary jaw clenching, a common aftermath of neurological trauma. Yet the cruelest twist was how these breakdowns shaped religion itself. The famous divine visions, recorded in the Book of the Dead where souls encounter gods in sun-blasted deserts, match exactly the symptoms of heat-induced psychosis. When Akhenaten claimed the sun disk ate and spoke to him, he may have been describing textbook solar delirium. Even the judgment scene in the afterlife, where hearts are weighed against feathers, echoes the distorted time perception of heatstroke victims who report moments stretching into eternities. Archaeologists found the smoking gun in a scribe's abandoned toolkit, a palette still stained with green malachite pigment beside a half-finished illustration of a god with spiraling eyes. The sketch matches contemporary descriptions of Ra's gaze during noonday prayers, when priests kneeling on scorching stone floors would see halos around the sun god's idol. What was worshipped as divine revelation may have been collective neurological meltdown, a civilization mistaking the brain's desperate cries for the whispers of gods. The stone brewery at Deir el-Medina never slept, its clay vats bubbling day and night to produce the thick, porridge-like beer that fueled an entire workforce. This wasn't the crisp lager we know today, but a nutrient-rich slurry barely stronger than kombucha, its alcohol content just high enough to kill pathogens without causing drunkenness. Every dawn, laborers lined up with their ceramic jugs to collect 10 pints each, not as a luxury, but as their primary source of hydration. The math was brutal. In temperatures regularly hitting 45 degrees, a worker hauling limestone blocks could lose up to 4 liters of sweat per hour. Drinking plain Nile water meant risking dysentery. Drinking nothing meant certain heat stroke. Beer became the only safe compromise. Archaeology reveals how deeply this practice was embedded in daily life. Excavated ration lists from the village show meticulous records, half a gallon per worker. Adjusted for children and the elderly, the brew itself was practically liquid bread, fermented from barley loaves crumbled into water, packed with calories, B vitamins, and electrolytes. Tomb paintings depict straws designed to filter out floating grain husks, while chemical residue analyses show traces of dates and honey added for quick energy boost. Even the leftover dregs weren't wasted, mixed with flour to make a second batch, creating a weaker children's beer that still held enough nutrients to supplement meager diets. But survival came with its own costs. Skeletal remains from worker cemeteries show startlingly high rates of tooth decay and abscesses, not from sugar, but from constant exposure to fermented grains that eroded enamel. Some mummies' livers display early signs of fibrosis, their bodies processing the equivalent of 5 modern beers daily for decades. The brewery's location near the village latrines speaks to another grim reality. While beer was safer than water, communal fermentation vats occasionally bred deadly mold. One mass grave contained 19 workers felled by what texts call the Black Stomach Curse, likely aflatoxin poisoning from contaminated grain. Yet the greatest testament to beer's necessity lies in the strikes recorded on Turin papyrus 3,000 years ago. When rations were delayed, workers laid down tools, shouting, "We have no beer," and making history's first documented labor protest not about wages, but hydration. Even their curses invoked brewing gods. May your throat parch like a vat left uncovered at noon. In a land where water could kill and shade was scarce, beer wasn't just drink. It was the difference between building a pharaoh's tomb and becoming one. Beneath the scorching sands, a hidden world of shadows offered the one luxury the living rarely knew: coolness. The rock-cut tombs of nobles stretched deep into cliffs, their descending corridors forming natural refrigerators where temperatures plummeted as much as 20 degrees compared to the surface. Workers who spent their days roasting under the sun knew these tunnels better than anyone. Their chisel marks still line the walls where they carved respite for the dead that they themselves were denied. At the Valley of the Kings, the contrast was cruelest. While laborers collapsed from heatstroke above, the sarcophagus chambers they polished for pharaohs held a crisp 65 degrees year-round, cool enough to make exhaled breath visible in torchlight. The engineering behind these subterranean sanctuaries was no accident. Builders angled entrance shafts precisely to trap heavier cold air below, while narrow ventilation channels, some no wider than a forearm, allowed warmer air to rise and escape without disturbing the stillness. Hieroglyphic work, orders from Deir el-Medina specify that certain tombs required the breath of the earth to flow correctly, referring to this delicate thermal balance. Some burial chambers even included recessed niches for evaporative cooling jars. As water seeped through porous clay, the air chilled further, preserving not just mummies but the very paint on the walls. The vivid blues and golds in Seti, the first tomb, owe their survival to this ancient air conditioning, yet the cruel irony clung to these walls like condensation. The same workers who engineered this escape from heat could never enjoy it. Guards stood watch at tomb entrances not just to deter thieves, but to prevent exhausted diggers from sneaking naps in the forbidden coolness. One ostraka from Ramses IV's reign records a worker being flogged for lying in the sacred dark, his crime resting in a finished tomb after 11 hours carving it. Even in death, class divisions held firm. While elites rested in climate-controlled eternity, their builders' shallow graves near the worksites baked under the same sun that killed them. Archaeologists found the proof in sweat. Microscopic analysis of tomb walls reveals salt crystals embedded deep in the stone, not from ceremonial liquids, but from the foreheads of workers who pressed against the cool rock in stolen moments of relief. Their silent rebellion survives in hidden corners where torch smudges mark spots they leaned when overseers weren't looking. The dead got perfect preservation while the living got scars. CT scans of laborers' mummies show deformed nasal cavities from years of breathing stone dust in those oxygen-starved depths. Perhaps the most haunting legacy lies in the tomb's unfinished sections. Near Amos's burial chamber, a half-carved corridor ends abruptly at a graffiti-covered wall where someone sketched a crude paradise scene: palm trees, a pool, and figures lounging in shade. Not a vision of the afterlife, but a worker's daydream of the impossible, coolness for the living. The artists never signed their name, but their message burns across millennia. Even in the land of the dead, the greatest luxury was a respite the builders could only carve, never share. Every muscle in your arms screams as you haul down on the shaduf's rough-hewn pole, the counterweight lifting its clay bucket from the Nile while your palms split open again on sun-baked wood. This wasn't just farming, it was hydraulic torture under a sky that turned skin to leather. The math was brutal. To irrigate 1 acre of wheat, a farmer might lift over 20,000 liters of water, each liter requiring 4 back-breaking pulls on the lever. Multiply that by Egypt's growing season, and you get calluses so thick they fossilize the same grotesque hand deformities found on laborers' mummies. their finger joints widened into permanent claws from decades of gripping that unforgiving pole. The device itself was elegantly simple, a horizontal beam balanced on a raised fulcrum, with a counterweight at one end and a bucket at the other, but simplicity didn't mean mercy. Operating it meant standing waist-deep in irrigation channels, where reflected sunlight doubled the heat's intensity, legs coated in mud that dried into a cracked second skin by midday. Field records from the reign of Amenhotep III revealed the true cost. Workers rotated every 15 minutes to prevent collapse, their shifts timed by overseers using sundials blackened with soot for better visibility. Even then, accounts describe men fainting face first into the water they just hauled, their exhausted bodies too dehydrated to produce sweat. Forensic archaeology confirms the horror. Mummified hands from agricultural cemeteries show 3 distinct trauma patterns: flattened fingerprints from constant friction, stress fractures in the metacarpals from uneven lifting, and most telling symmetrical grooves worn into the teeth. These are the marks of people who clenched their jaws unconsciously with every pull, their skulls preserving the silent screams their bodies no longer had water to voice. Some skeletons even display elongated right clavicles from years of asymmetrical strain, their bodies warping to the shadows rhythm like trees bent by unrelenting wind. Yet the cruelest details emerge from the tools themselves. Excavated shadow poles bear dark stains that tested positive for both blood and dates, evidence of workers pressing sticky fruit pulp into their wounds for makeshift bandages, while sugar gave fleeting energy boost. The buckets tell another story. Their bases are often thinner than the sides, worn down from being scraped along channel beds when users lack strength to lift them clear. And those iconic counterweights, far from smooth stones, they're found pitted with finger-sized indentations, grips for desperate hands when the main pole became too slick with sweat or blood. This was irrigation as endurance sport, where success wasn't measured in crop yields alone, but in how many seasons a body could last before the joints seized or the kidneys failed. Temple reliefs show smiling peasants operating shadows with ease, but the bone records whisper the truth. These were people who aged decades in a handful of harvests, their spines compressing from constant bending until they stood hunched like question marks carved in flesh. The Nile gave life, but its price was paid in vertebrae. The polished bronze floor of a war chariot might gleam impressively in the sunlight, but after 30 minutes of midday combat, it became a griddle hot enough to sear meat. At the Battle of Kadesh, where temperatures soared past 40 degrees Celsius, Ramses II's elite charioteers faced an enemy no sword could strike the blistering metal beneath their feet. Excavated chariots from this period reveal the horrifying evidence: flakes of leather still fused to the flooring, the remnants of sandals literally cooked onto the surface by ambient heat. These weren't battlefield accidents, they were slow-motion torture sessions conducted by the sun itself. The physics behind this suffering was merciless. Bronze, while ideal for deflecting arrows, conducted heat nearly 5 times faster than wood. Chariot designs exacerbated the problem. Elevated metal floors sat just inches above sun-baked terrain, creating a convection oven effect where hot air rising from the ground reheated the metal in a continuous cycle. Wall carvings at Abydos show crews shifting their weight awkwardly from foot to foot, a detail once thought to depict dynamic maneuvering, but now understood as desperate attempts to minimize contact with the burning plates. Medical papyri describe treatments for chariot foot, a condition where skin peeled away in sheets, exposing raw flesh that attracted flies mid-battle. Survival required gruesome improvisation. Some warriors stuffed wet reeds between their sandals and feet, trading blisters for the constant labor of rewetting the padding every few minutes. Others smeared thick layers of fat, often looted from enemy supply carts, onto the chariot floors, creating a temporary buffer that sizzled away within the hour. The wealthiest affixed thin sheets of imported cedar wood, but these warped in the heat, becoming uneven hazards that sent drivers tumbling during sharp turns. Archaeologists found one such modified chariot near Megiddo, its wooden veneer curled upward like a dried leaf, still embedded with the toe bones of its final occupant. The aftermath was even worse. Sunburnt feet swelled inside sandals, making dismounting impossible without cutting straps, a death sentence when enemy infantry closed in. Accounts from Kadesh describe Egyptian survivors crawling from wrecked chariots on elbows and knees, their blackened soles too damaged to bear weight. The few who made it home faced lifelong disabilities. Skeletal remains from charioteer cemeteries show fused toe joints and shortened Achilles tendons from years of walking on heels to avoid touching the ground. Perhaps the most telling artifact sits in the Egyptian Museum's storage, a child's practice chariot with a rare linen-wrapped floor. Inscribed by a royal tutor, the translation reads, "To learn the ways of war without learning its burns." Even in training, Egypt's elite acknowledged what their monuments never showed, that victory required withstanding torments fiercer than any human foe. The first breath you took in Memphis market place hit like a punch to the lungs, an unholy cocktail of cumin, rancid fish oil, and the metallic tang of sweat from 1,000 unwashed bodies. Under those flimsy linen awnings that flapped uselessly in the still air, temperature gradients turned the space into a layered hell, roasting heat at head height where sunlight filtered through the fabric, but ankle-deep in dust so fine it clung to damp skin like a second shadow. Traders shouted over the din, their voices hoarse from inhaling airborne chili powder that swirled invisible clouds whenever a rare breeze disturbed the stalls. This wasn't commerce, it was endurance theater performed on a stage of cracked mud bricks. Excavated merchant accounts from the New Kingdom reveal the brutal logistics. Spice vendors worked in 15-minute shifts, their eyes streaming tears from airborne pepper particulates, while butchers bribed water carriers to spray their stalls not for cleanliness, but to keep meat from visibly cooking on display slabs. One papyrus ledger lists a trader's daily losses: 10 deben of saffron spoiled by sweat drips, 3 jars of honey fermented in the heat before noon. Even wealth couldn't buffer the misery. Nobles sent slaves ahead with wet reeds to lay across walkways, creating fleeting cool zones underfoot until the reeds baked crisp as papyrus by mid-morning. The smells alone weaponized the climate. Archaeologists analyzing residue in Memphis market drains found traces of myrrh, fermented garlic, and dried Nile perch, a combination that, when heated, created a stench modern chemists compare to burning tires soaked in fish sauce. Workers at the frankincense stalls suffered worst. Resin melted into sticky puddles that glued sandals to stones, releasing concentrated fumes that induced vomiting in new apprentices. Medical texts describe market mouth, the condition where constant gagging eroded tooth enamel from stomach acid, yet the most telling artifacts emerged from the beggars' corners. Digs uncovered hundreds of tiny clay amulets shaped like noses, crudely inscribed with pleas to the god Bes for breath that doesn't burn. These weren't jokes, they were relics of a population literally choking on commerce. Even the market's lay out-confessed defeat perfume sellers clustered upwind of the fishmongers, creating invisible battle lines where luxury and survival stank alike. By high noon, the awnings became cruel illusions of shade. Infrared scans of surviving market walls show temperature differentials of less than 2 degrees between covered and uncovered areas. The fabric did little beyond trapping heavier, smellier air beneath it. Traders developed a peculiar gait, lifting their feet high to avoid sticking to spillage cooked sludge, their sandals leaving temporary prints in a surface that one Greek merchant described as walking on the gods' discarded soup. Memphis didn't just host markets, it slow roasted them, turning every transaction into a test of how much discomfort humans would endure for a handful of copper rings. The real profits went to the water sellers, those who circulated with bloated goatskins strapped to their backs, charging a week's wages for a single lukewarm cup. Their ledgers, preserved in cellar stores, show meticulous calculations. Day 13 of the second month, 47 cups sold a spice row, 12 collapses observed. The wealthiest merchants employed air wafters, slaves who waved palm fronds to create the illusion of breeze while subtly directing smells toward rival stalls. Survival here demanded more than sharp bargaining skills. It required a tolerance for misery that turned even the simplest purchase into a feat of physical endurance. At sunset, when the gates finally closed, the cleanup crews moved in. Ostraca records describe workers fainting while shoveling spoiled goods, their bodies overwhelmed by the day's accumulated heat still radiating from the stone. The waste pits tell the final story, layers of shattered perfume bottles, their expensive contents evaporated, warped copper scales fused to counting tables by accidental solar furnaces, even the occasional preserved sandal lost when some overwhelmed trader finally kicked free and fled barefoot. These weren't just discarded items, they were casualties of a daily battle where the real enemy never lowered its golden gaze from the cloudless sky. Before dawn's first light could warm the temple steps, the high priest of Karnak already stood waist-deep in water that steamed not from heat, but from the sheer cold shock of pre-dawn Nile immersion. This wasn't mere bathing, it was ritualized torture disguised as purification. Temple inscriptions describe the process with deceptive poetry. His body becomes the dew of dawn, his breath the north wind. The reality, priests plunged into stone cisterns filled with water drawn hours earlier from deep wells, liquid so frigid it numbed limbs within seconds. Emerging into air that could swing 30 degrees warmer by midday, their skin burned with the cruel irony of going from freezer to furnace in 3 trembling steps. The theological demands were merciless. To approach Amun-Ra's inner sanctum, a priest had to undergo not 1 but 5 successive cleansings each time to celestial movements, meaning some occurred under the sun's zenith. Wall carvings at Edfu show the grueling sequence. First the icy well water dunking, then a scalding scrub to open pores, followed by salt exfoliation that turned raw skin into a burning canvas. The 4th stage involved inhaling natron fumes through a heated copper tube, searing nasal passages to purify the breath, while the finale was the cruelest, standing motionless for an hour in direct sunlight as resins dried into a crackling second skin. Medical papyri list the casualties. Priest Nesamun, 18th day of Pani, collapsed during the 5th purification. His heart was weary. Archaeology confirms the suffering. Excavated priestly quarters near Luxor contained hidden caches of poppy tinctures and mandrake extracts, their jars labeled with euphemisms like Ra's mercy. Skeletal remains show patterns of repetitive stress, sprained wrists from gripping icy cistern rims, arthritic knees from kneeling on sun-heated altar stones, even elongated spinal grooves from the weight of sodden linen robes dragging on drenched back. The wealthiest prelates cheated when they could. One vizier's tomb boasted of commissioning moon-cooled water for his purifications, a luxury implying nighttime preparations to avoid the thermal shock. But the gods demanded equality in agony. During the Osiris mysteries at Abydos, even royalty endured the same trials. Queen Tiai's physician left accounts of treating her sun-induced blisters after she insisted on performing the full purification sequence. The ritual texts carry dreadful precision. He whose skin peels shall be made whole in the eyes of the gods. Translation: fainting wasn't failure, it was expected, perhaps even desired. Wall scenes in Hatshepsut's mortuary temple depict attendants catching swooning priests mid-ceremony, their collapse framed as divine ecstasy rather than heatstroke. The bitterest evidence lies in the temple floors themselves. Infrared scans reveal patches where stone wore thin from constant water spills, not ceremonial libations, but the sweat and ritual baths of countless priests. Some flagstones slope subtly toward drains, their surfaces grooved by centuries of sandal treads dragging from exhaustion. Even the god statues participated. Dawn light striking bronze cult images would heat them gradually, so that by midday, priests prostrating themselves might press their foreheads against metal hot enough to brand. Perhaps the most telling artifact sits in the Coptic Museum, a 4th century CE priest's diary, where pious Latin translations overlay older Egyptian complaints. One passage reads, "The spirit is willing, but the flesh blisters." Across 2,000 years of faith, some truths remained unburned by time. Even the mighty Epi's bull, a living god draped in gold and lotus garlands, wasn't immune to the sun's cruelty. When summer scorched Memphis, temple attendants would find the sacred animal collapsed in its own dung, sides heaving as its tongue lolled purple from heat exhaustion. Veterinary papyri from the New Kingdom detail the desperate measures taken to save these divine beasts. cold cucumber pulp packed into their rectums, Nile water mixed with honey poured over their testicles to cool vital organs, even fans operated by teams of slaves positioned to create artificial wind corridors. The treatments read like a frantic blend of science and prayer because for the Egyptians, losing an Apis bull wasn't just an agricultural disaster, it was like watching a deity suffocate in slow motion. Farm animals fared far worse. Excavated stable floors at Amarna bear permanent hoof scar patterns where cows and goats stamped in agony as their body temperatures spiked. One particularly chilling ostracon from a cattle overseer's records lists losses during a single heat wave. 10 oxen fallen, 3 revived with onion juice enemas, 7 turned to roast by noon. The description wasn't hyperbole. Under direct sunlight, black-hided animals could literally cook from the inside, their stomach fluids boiling as intestines twisted. Archaeologists have found mummified livestock with burst blood vessels in their eyes, the telltale sign of heat stroke so severe it caused brain hemorrhages before death. The treatments prescribed were equal parts ingenious and heartbreaking. A veterinary scroll from Saqqara details how farmers would bury donkeys up to their necks in wet sand for hours, creating a makeshift cooling blanket. Sheep were force-fed fermented grape mash not for intoxication, but because the sugars help retain precious fluids. Goats received shaved bellies smeared with crocodile fat, exploiting the reptile's low thermal conductivity to create a barrier against radiating heat from the ground. Even poultry got desperate interventions. Temple records describe priests inserting chilled limestone eggs into overheated geese's nests, both to lower body temperatures and trick the birds into ceasing egg production during dangerous heat spikes. But the most telling artifacts come from the workers themselves. Digs at Deir el-Bahri uncovered tiny amulets shaped like cattle, pierced with holes where they'd once hung around necks. Initially dismissed as mere trinkets, thermoluminescence dating revealed these were emergency tools when dipped in water and hung in barns. The porous clay created slight evaporative cooling. Their inscriptions tell the real story, Hathor's breath upon my herds. These weren't decorations, they were last-ditch prayers against a foe no sickle could cut, the same blazing sky that nurtured crops one season and stole breaths the next. The cruelty of this balancing act survives in bone records. Cattle skeletons from prosperous periods show rib fractures from overzealous cooling attempts, likely from farmers packing too much wet mud onto heaving flank. Drought-era remains tell grimmer tales. Teeth marks on bones where starving workers gnawed at animals that died mid-treatment, their meat already spoiled by the very heat that killed them. Even the gods mirrored this suffering. The lioness goddess Sek meant wasn't just a bringer of war, she embodied the feverish delirium that plagued both man and beast when the world burned too bright. Perhaps the most haunting evidence lies not in grand temples, but in the quiet corners of workmen's villages. Beneath one humble home at Kehan, archaeologists found a tiny sarcophagus containing a mummified mouse, its paws clutching a scrap of linen inscribed with the butcher's plea, "Forgive me for taking what the sun first stole." In the end, whether facing a sacred bull's collapse or a field goat's last breaths, the Egyptians understood a brutal truth. Under Ra's unblinking gaze, all creatures knelt equally. By the time the moon cast its silver glow over the worker villages of Deir el-Medina, the streets were already bustling with activity, not revelry, but the quiet urgency of a civilization that treated darkness as a commodity. The Egyptians didn't just adapt to the heat, they engineered their entire work schedule around its absence. Lunar calendars etched into pottery shards reveal a ruthless efficiency. Labor wasn't just shifted to cooler hours, it was compressed into the narrow window between midnight and dawn when stars still dotted the sky and the earth retained fragments of the night's chill. These weren't suggestions, they were survival protocols. Archaeologists found the proof in the ruins of scribes' quarters, astronomical charts scratched onto limestone flakes, their surfaces worn smooth from daily consultation. One particularly detailed fragment from the reign of Ramses III shows Sirius rising beside notations for quarry shifts, the star's appearance signaling when chisels should start striking stone. Workers didn't wake to roosters or sunlight, but to trained timekeepers who tracked constellations like modern shift managers' watch clocks. The system was precise. the moon's position dictated whether a crew would haul stones under full lunar light or by the faint glow of oil-soaked rags wrapped around poles. But this nocturnal productivity came at a cost. Medical papyri describe moon headaches, chronic migraines from disrupted circadian rhythms, treated with poppy-infused wine gulped between tasks. Workers' skeletons tell another story: enlarged eye sockets from decades of straining in low light, vertebrae curved from hunching over star charts, even teeth grooved from clenching reed torches while hands carved tomb. The wealthier fared little better. Noblemen's correspondence complains of sleeplessness, their bodies trapped between the demands of daytime rituals and nighttime oversight of estate workers. The greatest irony, while the elites obsessed over solar deities, their entire economy ran on stolen moonlit hours. A scribe's journal from Thebes captures this dissonance perfectly. Ra rules the sky, but thought silver disk feeds our children. Even the gods couldn't change the math. 12 hours of darkness might yield 6 usable work hours before the creeping dawn brought back the furnace. Those workers' villages weren't just homes. They were carefully calibrated survival pods where every activity, from baking bread to mending sandals, was timed to celestial movement. Yet the most haunting evidence of this lunar tyranny lies in the art they left behind. Tomb paintings meant to depict idyllic afterlives often show anomalous details: workers harvesting wheat under starry skies, boats drifting on midnight Niles, even banquet scenes illuminated by torches rather than sunlight. Egypt's dream of eternity wasn't a sun-drenched paradise, but an endless cool night where labor didn't mean suffering. The stars they charted weren't just tools, they were promises of relief burned into the darkness. Centuries before modern air conditioning hummed in desert cities, ancient Egyptian architects had already cracked the code for passive cooling, and their innovations still whisper through the walls of today's most advanced sustainable buildings. Take the wind catchers, those towering rectangular chimneys crowning noble villas along the Nile. Far from mere decoration, these structures were precision engineered to harness even the faintest breezes, funneling air downward through narrow shafts where it cooled against subterranean stone chambers before spilling into living spaces. At Amarna, archaeologists found remnants of these elegant wind tunnels lined with porous ceramic jars filled with water, nature's earliest swamp coolers, creating drafts up to 15 degrees cooler than outdoor air. The genius lay in their simplicity: no moving parts, just physics manipulated by geometry. Modern architects from Dubai to Arizona now replicate this principle in skyscrapers, where double-walled facades and solar chimneys owe their DNA to those ancient mudbrick prototypes. Then, there were the evaporative cooling jars. Ordinary clay vessels turned into thermal powerhouses. Buried up to their necks in sand beneath homes, these porous pots wicked moisture slowly through their walls, chilling the surrounding earth through evaporation. Workers at Deir el-Medina slept atop these cooling cells, their sleeping mats positioned over grids of jars that turned nighttime into a rare respite. Experiments using reconstructed jars show temperatures dropping 7 degrees in just 30 minutes, a life-saving margin when summer nights hovered near body temperature. Today's desert builders have resurrected this tech with a twist. Contemporary earth tubes made of terracotta pipe mimic these ancient systems, passively cooling homes from Australia's outback to Morocco's Casbahs. The most surprising legacy might be in urban planning. Excavated worker villages reveal streets intentionally narrowed to create urban canyons, forcing air to accelerate and cool as it squeezed between buildings, an ancient precursor to the windscaping principles now revolutionizing cities like Maastricht. Even the humble palm tree played its part. Temple complexes were ringed with date palms not just for fruit, but because their broad leaves created microclimates up to 10 degrees cooler through transpiration. Modern studies confirm this effect, prompting desert landscapers to revive these ancient agroforestry techniques around solar farms and urban plazas. But perhaps the greatest testament to Egyptian ingenuity lies in what they didn't build. Analysis of Theban housing shows entire neighborhoods oriented to block the summer sun while inviting winter light, a technique now formalized as solar setback in green architecture. Their reed mat ceilings, layered like feathers, provided insulation that outperforms many modern synthetic materials when tested in identical conditions. Even their color choices were calculated. The ubiquitous whitewashed walls reflected 60% more sunlight than unpainted surfaces, a discovery that's reshaped everything from Mediterranean villages to Mars habitat design. The proof of this legacy isn't just in museums, it's etched into the survival strategies of desert cultures worldwide. From the Qanats of Persia to the courtyard houses of Andalusia, each carries fragments of Egyptian wisdom. Contemporary engineers have only recently quantified what these ancients knew instinctually, that working with heat rather than against it yields solutions both elegant and enduring. When a Bedouin tent stays cooler than a nearby concrete shack, or when a modern, cool roof coating mimics the infrared reflectance of aged limestone, the ghosts of those Nile Valley architects nod in quiet recognition. Their greatest monument wasn't carved in stone. It was woven into the very fabric of how humanity inhabits hostile climates, a living lesson written in wind and shadow. Standing in your climate-controlled apartment right now, sipping ice water that didn't require hauling from a river, you're living a life those pyramid builders would have considered godlike. The gap between their reality and ours isn't just measured in centuries, it's written in sweat. We tap a button for cool air while they design entire cities to cheat the sun's wrath. We complain when Wi-Fi's slow while they rationed beer as medicine against dehydration. Their civilization wasn't just built on sand, it was forged in a crucible of heat so relentless it reshaped human biology. Modern mummy scans reveal spines compressed from decades of carrying water under a murderous sky, teeth worn down from chewing salt-hardened bread, leg bones bowed from standing hours in scorching irrigation ditches. These weren't weak people, they were titanium tough. Yet here's the unsettling question humming beneath our admiration: have we lost something vital in our retreat from discomfort? Imagine turning off your air conditioning for just 1 week this summer, not as some minimalist challenge, but as a time machine to their world. Within hours, your laptop would overheat. By day 2, your food would spoil despite the fridge. By week's end, you'd be drinking warm, questionable tap water while your skin crusted with salt from endless sweating. Now layer on plowing fields, hauling stones, or marching in armor under that same sun. Suddenly, their achievements stop seeming like ancient history and start feeling like superhuman feat. The cruelest irony, that same heat that nearly broke them also made them legendary. Without it, there'd be no mummies preserved like leather, no math born from tracking floods and droughts, no architecture honed by battling the elements. Hardship was their innovation incubator, every shadow lever, windcatcher shaft, and salt cured meat recipe, a testament to human ingenuity hammered on the anvil of necessity. Our modern comforts, for all their blessings, come with hidden costs: softer bodies, shorter attention spans, a gasp of exhaustion when the power flickers for 5 minutes. So before you romanticize linen tunics and moonlit farming shifts, ask yourself the real question: could you have survived, not as a time-traveling tourist with bottled water and sunscreen, but as one of them blistered hands gripping a chisel at noon, throat raw from dust storms, praying to gods who ruled by fire? Their civilization didn't just endure, it thrived in conditions that would leave most of us weeping within hours. And that's the humbling truth whispering through these ruins, we're the delicate ones now. The pyramids stand not just as tombs, but as mile markers on humanity's long retreat from resilience. Your move, modern world, comments are open.